The desert has a way of swallowing things. You drive out past the edge of the towns, past the last of the streetlights, and you realize how easily a secret could just sit there, buried in the sand, waiting for the wind to uncover it. We talk about Roswell as if it were a single moment, a thunderclap in the middle of a quiet July, but looking back, it feels more like a slow, creeping ripple. It started with a rumor, a whisper about something metallic found on a ranch, and it grew into the defining mystery of our age. We want to know what fell that night. We want to know why the story changed. But maybe the question isn't what happened in the desert, but why we have spent 70 years looking back at the sand, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. If you have ever driven through the high desert of New Mexico after the sun goes down, you know that the dark out there is different from the dark in the city. It feels heavy, almost physical, like a blanket that settles over the earth and stays there until the sun drags it back off. You look out your window, and for miles there is nothing but the scrub, the low hills, and the flat, gray dirt. In the daytime, it looks empty, but at night, that emptiness changes into something else. It changes into a space where you feel small, where the distance between you and the next human being isn't just measured in miles, but in a kind of deep, ancient isolation. I think about that landscape a lot when I think about July of 1947. It was a summer that felt heavy, I imagine, the way summers do when the world is trying to reset itself after a long war. People were trying to get back to normal, trying to find a rhythm in their lives. And out there in Lincoln County, normal meant looking after sheep, checking the fences, and watching the sky for rain. Rain is a big deal in the desert. When it comes fast, with lightning that splits the sky wide open and thunder that shakes the dishes in the cupboard. It is violent, and then it is gone, leaving the air smelling like ozone and wet creosote. When we talk about the Roswell incident, we usually skip straight to the town, or the base, or the wreckage. We want the details. We want the pieces of metal and the bodies and the men in uniform. But if you want to understand why this thing has stayed with us for 70 years, you have to start with the dirt. You have to start with the sheer scale of the place. New Mexico is vast. Even today, with our highways and our cell towers and our satellites, you can get lost out there and nobody would find you for days. In 1947, that isolation was even more absolute. There were no cell phones, obviously. There were barely any paved roads once you got off the main drag. A ranch wasn't just a house. It was an island in a sea of grass and rock. If something fell from the sky in a place like that, it didn't fall on a town. It didn't land in someone's backyard while they were grilling dinner. It came down in the middle of nowhere, a place where the only witnesses were the rocks and the wind. And that makes you realize how fragile our history really is. We depend on people being there to see things, to write them down, to tell someone else. But the desert doesn't keep records. The desert doesn't care about what falls into it. It just swallows it up, lets the dust settle over it, and waits. I wonder what it felt like to live out there back then. You would spend days without seeing a new face. You would listen to the radio at night, maybe catch a signal from a station hundreds of miles away, fading in and out through the static. The world outside felt far away, almost abstract. The things that mattered were the immediate things, the water level in the well, the heat, the wind. The sky was your ceiling, and it was a big ceiling. You would look up at night and see the Milky Way like a bright white smear across the black. You knew every star, or at least you knew the shapes they made. You would notice if something changed. You would notice a light that didn't belong. But the night of the storm, the night everything supposedly started, the sky wasn't clear. It was a mess of clouds and wind. It was the kind of night where you stay inside, close the windows against the dust, and just listen to the house creak. A house in the desert has a voice. It expands in the heat of the day and contracts in the cold of the night, popping and groaning like an old ship. When the thunder starts, it drowns out everything else. It is a loud, rattling noise that fills your ears and makes your chest vibrate. In a place that isolated, a storm feels personal. It feels like it is happening just for you or against you. And when the lightning flashes, for a fraction of a second, the whole landscape is lit up as bright as noon. You see the hills, the fences, the sheep huddled against the brush. And then it goes black again, blacker than before, and your eyes have to adjust all over again. If something happened out there during that storm, if something came down through the clouds, it would have been hidden by the rain and the noise. It would have been just another sound in a night full of them. I find myself thinking about the silence that comes after a desert storm. It is a peculiar kind of quiet. The wind drops, the rain stops, and the earth is just wet and still. The frogs start up in the washes, a low, rhythmic clicking that sounds almost mechanical if you listen to it long enough. That is the moment where the world feels clean, like everything has been washed away. But that summer, the quiet didn't last. Something had changed in the dirt, out on a ranch miles from anywhere, and the ripple was about to start. It is hard for us now to imagine how separate that life was. We are so connected, so constantly aware of everything happening everywhere all the time. If a plane goes down today, we know about it within minutes. We see the photos, we see the coordinates, we see the tweets. But in 1947, a man could find something strange on his land, look at it, walk around it, and it might take him days just to decide to tell someone. Not because he was lazy, but because going into town was a chore. It required planning. It required gas, which was still something you thought twice about back then. And the town of Roswell itself wasn't the bustling place it is now. It was a quiet community built on agriculture and the military. The airfield was there, the Roswell Army Airfield, and that gave the town a specific kind of energy. It was a serious place. The men stationed there weren't just regular soldiers. They were part of the only atomic bombing group in the world. They had a job to do, a job that required absolute secrecy and absolute discipline. They were living in the shadow of the Cold War, a war that hadn't really been named yet, but everyone could feel coming. So you have these two worlds sitting next to each other in the desert. On one hand, you have the ranchers, people who lived by the ancient rules of the land, independent, slow to move, deeply tied to the physical world beneath their boots. On the other hand, you have the military, modern, secretive, looking at the sky not for rain, but for threats, operating under orders that came from thousands of miles away. They shared the same air, the same heat, the same dust, but they looked at the world through completely different eyes. When those two worlds finally collided that July, it didn't happen with a big confrontation. It happened quietly, with a drive into town, a conversation in an office, and a look at some debris. but the foundation for the mystery was already there, built into the very geography of the place. The isolation meant that whatever happened could be contained, or at least, people thought it could be. It meant that the number of people who knew the truth was small, small enough to fit into a single room. If you go out there now to the places where people say the crash happened, you won't find a monument. You won't find a sign pointing the way. You just find the desert. The same creosote bushes, the same dry grass, the same gray dirt. The wind still blows, taking the top layer of sand and moving it somewhere else, slowly erasing any footprint, any tire track, any memory of what might have occurred. It makes you realize that the land doesn't care about our secrets. It doesn't care about our conspiracies or our official reports. It just stays there, old and quiet, keeping its own counsel under the big, empty sky. I think that is why the story has such a hold on us. It is because the setting is so perfect for a secret. You can look at that landscape and believe that anything could happen out there, and nobody would ever know. It invites the imagination to fill the empty space. When the details are missing, when the witnesses are gone, and when the government files are redacted or missing, the desert remains. It becomes the canvas where we paint our fears and our hopes, a place where the truth is always just over the next ridge, hidden in the shadows of the low hills, waiting for someone to walk out into the dark and find it. The life of a rancher in 1947 was not a dramatic existence. It was a life built on a series of small, repetitive loops. You wake up before the sun, you drink coffee that tastes like the dark, you check the water tanks, you mend the fences, and you watch the sky. It is a slow, steady pulse of labor that keeps you tethered to the earth. Mac Brazel, a man who had spent years out on the Foster Ranch, knew the rhythm of that land better than he knew the faces of the people in town. He knew how the light hit the hills at dawn. He knew where the dry washes would turn into rivers after a storm. And he knew, with a quiet, observational precision, every single thing that belonged on his land. So on that morning in early July, when the storm had finally passed and the desert was still dripping with the residue of a violent night, he went out to check his sheep. He wasn't looking for a secret. He wasn't looking for a conspiracy. He was looking for damage. That was the extent of his concern. He walked the perimeter, keeping an eye on the ground, expecting to see a downed branch or a segment of fence pushed over by the gale force winds. But then he came across the debris. It wasn't a crash site, at least not in the way we picture it today. There was no crater. There was no smoldering fire. There was no twisted wreckage of an engine. It was just a field stretched out across the earth, scattered with things that seemed to have been spilled from a giant's pocket. It covered hundreds of yards, and as he walked through it, the silence of the desert must have felt different. It wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty pasture anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of something that didn't belong. He started picking things up. That is the part of the story that always lingers with me, the tactile reality of it. We talk about it in the abstract now as the Roswell debris, but for him it was physical. It was thin, tough foil that felt like nothing he'd ever held. You'd think that if something fell from the sky, it would be heavy or sharp or jagged. But this was different. He tried to crush the foil in his hand, and it sprang back to its original shape. It had a kind of memory, a resistance that was alien to the way we understand the world. and then there were the sticks. They looked like balsa wood, incredibly light, but when he tried to break them, they were as strong as steel. They had these strange, geometric markings on them, patterns that didn't seem to serve a function, almost like they were decorative, or perhaps like they were a language he couldn't read. Can you imagine the feeling in the pit of your stomach? You are a man who deals in tangible things, wood, wire, wool, stone, and you are suddenly standing in the middle of an impossible geometry. Most of us, if we were in that situation, would probably freeze. We would be paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it. But Mac Brazel did what a rancher does. He kept working. He walked the field, he observed, he took it in. He didn't rush to the phone. He didn't jump in his truck to scream at the sheriff. He sat with it. He let the mystery sit in his pocket for a few days. I think about why he waited. Was he afraid? Was he trying to find a logical explanation? Or was he simply living in a time where you didn't rush to tell the world about your business? Back then, privacy wasn't just a right, it was a habit. You kept your own counsel. You didn't want the fuss. You didn't want the government or the neighbors or the curiosity seekers coming out to trample your grass. He was alone with the biggest secret in the history of the world, and he was doing his chores. There is something deeply unnerving about that. The fact that the truth of the universe was sitting in a pasture, and for a few days it was completely ignored by the rest of humanity. It wasn't being guarded by the military. It wasn't being analyzed by scientists. It was just sitting there, under the desert sun, waiting. And the weather kept moving. The wind kept blowing. The debris continued to weather the elements, exposed and vulnerable, as if the universe were indifferent to the fact that it had just left its calling card in the middle of a New Mexico ranch. The rancher walked back to his house. The debris stayed in the field, and the gap between what he knew and what the world knew began to widen. How do you reconcile that? How do you have a cup of coffee in the morning, knowing that just over the ridge, the rules of physics have been broken? I think about his internal state. Did he feel like he had discovered a treasure, or did he feel like he had stumbled upon a curse? He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a dreamer. He was just a man living a life that was about to be obliterated by what he had found. The silence of those days is the most profound part of the Roswell story. It was the last moment of innocence. It was the only time the event belonged to him. Once he decided to tell someone, once he set the machinery of the modern world into motion, that innocence was gone. The debris would be carted away, the details would be buried, and the story would be transformed into something else entirely, something that no longer had anything to do with a rancher, a pasture, or a storm. But for those few days, it was just a man and the impossible. And as the sun went down over the desert, casting long, deep shadows across the ranch, the debris lay there, reflecting the fading light, waiting for the world to notice it. The rancher lay in his bed, listening to the house creak, thinking about the metal that wouldn't crush and the wood that wouldn't break, and wondering if his life would ever feel normal again. I suspect that for the rest of his days, he never really felt like the world was the same. Once you've seen something that doesn't fit, the edges of reality never quite look right again. You spend the rest of your life looking at the ground, wondering if you'll find another piece of the puzzle, and fearing that you will. You have to understand that for those few days, the secret was just a weight in his pocket. It wasn't a global event. It wasn't a historical anomaly. It was just a conversation Mac Brazel was having with himself. You walk around, you eat your meals, you talk to your animals, and all the while, the impossible is sitting out there in the pasture, waiting for the rain to wash it deeper into the ground. It has to be a lonely feeling. To possess a truth that contradicts the reality everyone else is living, that has to be the loneliest thing in the world. Eventually, the pressure of it must have become too much. It isn't that you want to be famous or that you want to cause a stir. It is just that the human mind isn't built to contain things that don't make sense. We are wired to share. We are wired to say, "Look at this," and wait for someone else to say, "Oh, I see it too." And if they don't see it, or if they look at you like you are crazy, then you start to wonder if the problem is the object, or if the problem is you. So he went into town. It wasn't a sudden, frantic dash. It was a normal trip, the kind he made all the time to get supplies or check in with the neighbors. Corona was the place, a small stop where people knew each other's business, and the pace of life was just as slow as it was on the ranch. I imagine the dust on his truck, the rattle of the suspension, the way the heat waves shimmered off the road ahead. He was carrying the secret with him, and I wonder if he felt like he was walking on glass. He started talking. Maybe it was to the neighbors, maybe it was to the sheriff, I don't know. But the moment you speak, the moment you put the experience into words, you realize how inadequate language is. How do you describe metal that has memory? How do you describe sticks that are stronger than steel but lighter than wood? You sound like a man who has had too much sun. You sound like a man who is prone to spinning yarns. And that is the tragedy of it. The truth is so strange that it sounds like a lie, and the more you try to explain it, the more you look like someone who has lost their grip. The response he got wasn't awe. It wasn't fear. It was skepticism. It was the shrug of a man who has heard 1,000 stories about coyotes and dust devils and tricks of the light. Are you sure it isn't a weather balloon? That is the question that must have haunted him. It is the question that effectively shut down the mystery before it had even begun. Because if you accept the weather balloon explanation, the mystery vanishes. You can go back to sleep. You can go back to your chores. You don't have to carry the weight anymore. But he had touched it. He had felt it. He knew it wasn't a balloon. And that doubt, that small, sharp, nagging doubt, is what changed everything. It was the friction between his experience and the official, dismissive answer he was getting from the world around him. He wasn't looking for a conspiracy. He was just looking for a witness. He wanted someone to look at the debris and tell him that he wasn't crazy. But the world wasn't interested in his sanity. The world was interested in order. And order dictated that whatever fell from the sky had to be something we already knew. When the sheriff finally got involved, it felt like the natural, administrative next step. This is what you do when you find something strange. You call the authorities. You hand the problem off to someone with a uniform, someone with a badge, someone whose job it is to deal with things that don't belong. It was a relief, I'm sure, to be able to say, "I found this, you deal with it." It was the shedding of the burden, but in doing so, he was also surrendering the debris. He was walking away from the evidence. And that, I think, is where the story truly shifts from a rancher's observation to a military affair. Because the moment you involve the authorities, you are no longer the one telling the story. The The narrative is taken out of your hands. It is filed away in an office. It is written into a report, and it is sanitized. I try to imagine the phone call to the base. I try to imagine the tone of voice. Was he nervous? Did he downplay it? Did he realize, even then, that he was opening a door that would never be closed again? The desert was vast, and it was empty, and it felt like it could hold any secret. But the military was different. The military was the opposite of the desert. It was precise, it was regimented, and it was terrified of secrets it couldn't control. The transition was subtle. It wasn't a raid, it wasn't a blockade. It was just a conversation, a tip, a report of a crashed object. And in that moment, the secret escaped the pasture. It entered the system. It started to travel up the chain of command, from the rancher to the sheriff to the base commander. It was gaining weight. It was gaining mass. It was becoming something that no longer had a place in the quiet, dusty world of a sheep rancher. It is a sobering thought how quickly our personal experiences can be co-opted by larger institutions. You have a moment of wonder, a moment of confusion, a moment where the veil between the known and the unknown thins, and then, almost immediately, the experts arrive to tell you what you saw. They arrive to frame your experience, to categorize it, to put a label on it. And by the time they are finished, you aren't sure if what you remember is what actually happened, or if you are just remembering the explanation they gave you. And I think Mac Brazel must have walked back to his truck that day with a hollow feeling in his chest. He had done the right thing. He had followed the rules. He had told the people who were supposed to know. And yet, I suspect he knew that the mystery wasn't solved. He knew that the things he had held in his hands weren't balloons. But who was he to argue? He was just a man who worked the land. And the world, with all its expertise and its uniforms and its authority, was about to tell him exactly what he had found, whether he believed it or not. The road back to the ranch must have felt longer than usual. The desert didn't look different. The hills were the same, the dust was the same, the heat was the same, but the space felt crowded. It felt like the world had finally caught up to his secret, and it was about to swallow it whole. The quiet, solitary life he had known was about to be replaced by something else. The machinery of the state was turning, the gears were grinding, and the truth was being prepared for its long, slow, and very thorough burial. There was a specific gravity to the Roswell Army Air Field back then. It wasn't just another base. It was the home of the 509th Composite Group, the only unit in the entire world with the capability to deliver an atomic bomb. You have to understand that context to really grasp the mindset of the men stationed there. They weren't soldiers playing at war. They were the guardians of the most destructive power humanity had ever unleashed. They lived in a world where everything had to be accounted for, where secrets were the currency of their existence, and where a mistake could quite literally mean the end of a city. So, when the reports started coming in from the Foster Ranch, when the officers were sent out into the scrub to collect whatever it was that had fallen, they weren't approaching it with the wide-eyed wonder of a science fiction enthusiast. They were approaching it as a potential breach in security. They were looking for threats. They were looking for evidence of a foreign power or a secret project or something that could jeopardize the stability of the fragile, post-war peace they were sworn to protect. I imagined the scene in the commander's office as the reports trickled back. You have to picture the dust, the heat, the smell of cigarette smoke in the office, and the way the ceiling fans churned the heavy, stagnant air. The officers who went to the site came back with stories that didn't fit. They didn't come back with pieces of a Russian plane. They didn't come back with the charred remnants of an experimental weather device. They came back with something that didn't have a name. There is a moment in every mystery where the people in charge make a choice. They decide how to interpret the anomaly, and in that office, the choice was made to be honest. It is the most baffling part of the entire Roswell story, and it is the part that keeps me up at night. They decided to tell the truth, or at least, they decided to tell what they thought was the truth. They issued a press release. It was simple, it was typed on standard paper, and it hit the wire services with a thud that echoed for the next 70 years. RAAF captures flying disc on ranch in Roswell region. It's just a sentence, isn't it? But read it again. Imagine you are a civilian in 1947, picking up the afternoon paper and seeing that headline. We think of the flying saucer phenomenon as something that came later, something that was fueled by movies and pulp magazines and the culture of the 50s. But here it was, in black and white, endorsed by the United States military. What were they thinking? Were they so sure of what they had seen that they felt they had no choice but to announce it? Or were they trying to get ahead of the story, hoping that by being the ones to break the news, they could control the fallout? I think it was a moment of genuine human shock. I think the officers who had been out to the ranch had looked at the wreckage, at the foil, at the sticks, at the strange, shimmering reality of the materials, and their brains had failed to categorize it. They didn't see a weather balloon. They saw something that felt alien, and they felt a desperate, panicked need to report it. But the reaction from above was almost instantaneous. The moment that press release went out, the machinery of the state kicked into gear. The phones started ringing. The orders were handed down. And within 24 hours, the flying disc had become a weather balloon. It was an abrupt, jarring pivot, the kind of about-face that makes you realize how quickly a narrative can be dismantled when the stakes are high enough. I wonder what it felt like for the public information officer, Walter Haut, to issue that first release and then, the very next day, be tasked with the retraction. That has to be a strange, uncomfortable sensation, to be the voice of authority one day and the voice of apology the next. It's a humiliation. It strips away your credibility. But in the military, you don't argue. You follow the path that has been cleared for you. And just like that, the flying disc was gone. It was scrubbed from the public record, replaced by the mundane, boring, and utterly forgettable image of a Rowan target, a radar-reflecting device used for weather balloons. It was a perfect explanation. It was grounded in technology that existed, it was plausible, and it was dull. It was designed to make people stop looking. It was designed to make the question go away, but the doubt had already been planted. You can't unring a bell. The public had been told, by the highest authority in the land, that something extraordinary had fallen in the desert. And when the explanation shifted to something so pedestrian, the disconnect became a permanent part of the Roswell story. It wasn't the crash that created the mystery, it was the retraction. It was the silence that followed the shift in the story. I think about the soldiers who were involved in the retrieval. Many of them were young, just doing their jobs, following orders. They were part of a team that had just successfully handled the most significant event of their lives, and then they were told to forget it. They were told it never happened. How do you live with that? How do you suppress a memory that is so vivid, so tactile, so impossible to ignore? Do you tell yourself it was just a balloon? Or do you keep the secret in the back of your mind, like a grain of sand in a shoe, rubbing you the wrong way for the rest of your life? There is a sense of tragedy in that. We talk about the incident as a conspiracy, a word that sounds cold and calculated, but it feels more like a mess. It feels like a moment where human perception, human error, and the crushing weight of national security all collided in the middle of a New Mexico summer. It wasn't a grand, diabolical plan. It was just a group of people trying to deal with a reality that had suddenly, and without warning, become too big for them to understand. The cleanup wasn't some cinematic, high-speed operation. It was just labor. It was a group of men in uniform, sweating through their shirts in the middle of a New Mexico July, picking up trash. That's what it had to be, right? If you're going to erase an event, you don't do it with a fanfare. You do it by making it look like a mundane, administrative headache. You do it by treating the debris like it's just a piece of faulty equipment that needs to be collected so you don't get in trouble with your superiors. I imagine the soldiers walking the field, eyes locked on the dirt. They were told to get everything, every scrap of foil, every splinter of that strange, resilient wood, every piece of tape. They were combed over that pasture until there was nothing left but the grass and the stones. And I wonder, as they were doing it, what they were thinking. Did they look at the material in their hands and feel the same confusion the rancher did? Did they wonder why they were being told to pack it up so quickly, so quietly? There is a specific psychology to that kind of order. You are a soldier, you are trained to follow, and you are told that what you are doing is a matter of national security. You don't ask questions. You just fill the bags, but you're still a human being. You're still a person who has eyes and a brain, and you know when you are looking at something that doesn't fit the pattern of your world. I suspect that for many of them, that day in the field was the beginning of a long, private struggle, a struggle to reconcile the evidence of their own eyes with the official story that was being constructed above their heads. The pivot to the weather balloon narrative was, in its own way, a masterclass in psychological management. You don't tell people the truth is a secret. You tell them the truth is boring. You tell them that what they saw was a mistake, an equipment failure, a mundane piece of government hardware that got lost in a storm. It's almost impossible to get excited about a weather balloon. It's the kind of thing that makes your eyes glaze over. And that was the point. By framing the flying disc as a simple, embarrassing confusion, they effectively shut down the curiosity of the public, but it left a scar. It created a split in the public consciousness, a divide between the official record and the lingering, stubborn doubt of the people who knew better. And I think that divide is the real legacy of Roswell. It's the moment we stopped trusting the information we were given. It's the moment we realized that there were stories being told, and then there were the realities that lay beneath them, hidden away in bags and loaded into the back of trucks. I try to visualize the base after the debris was brought in. The tension must have been palpable. There were people there who knew exactly what had been found, and there were people who were being told to look the other way. You have this intersection of absolute, rigid hierarchy and the chaotic, impossible reality of the unknown. How do you keep a secret like that? How do you keep everyone in line? Maybe you don't. Maybe you just create enough confusion, enough doubt, and enough bureaucracy that the secret ends up protecting itself. And what about the debris itself? The pieces they collected, the foil, the struts, the strange, flowered tape. Where did it go? We talk about it being flown to right field, about it being studied, about it being stored in a hangar somewhere, gathering dust. It's become a legend, a relic of a holy war between what we know and what we are told. It is a piece of history that has been erased from the official timeline, yet it remains the cornerstone of everything we think we know about the visitors. There is a sadness in the way it all ended, with a press conference, a few photos of a tattered balloon, and a story about a misunderstanding. It feels like the death of a miracle. We had this moment where the universe seemed to reach out, where the impossible touched the earth, and then we turned it into a clerical error. We turned it into a joke, and then we moved on. We had a war to win, an economy to build, a future to secure. There wasn't time for fairy tales, but the debris wasn't just metal and plastic. It was a challenge. It was a question posed to our reality. And by suppressing it, by turning it into a weather balloon, we didn't answer the question. We just decided that we didn't want to hear it. We decided that it was easier to live in a world where things fell from the sky for boring reasons than a world where we were not the masters of our own horizon. I suspect that for the men who walked that field, the memory never really faded. You don't just forget the impossible, you bury it. You tuck it away in the corner of your mind, behind the regulations and the orders and the life you built afterward. But every now and then, maybe in the quiet of the night, or when you're looking up at the stars, it comes back. You remember the way the foil felt in your hand. You remember the way the wood didn't break. And you wonder, just for a second, what would have happened if you had said something else? What would have happened if you had told the truth? But the moment passed. The trucks were loaded, the site was cleared, and the desert returned to its silence. The wind moved the dust over the place where the impossible had touched the ground, and the world kept turning. The mystery was successfully contained, but it was also transformed. It was no longer a piece of wreckage in a pasture. It was an idea. And ideas, as we have learned, are much harder to clean up than metal and wood. There is a specific kind of whiplash that comes with a sudden retraction. You are reading a story, you believe it, you start to feel the thrill of it, and then, before you can even finish your coffee, the ground shifts. The headline you read in the afternoon paper is contradicted by the statement the next morning. It creates a vacuum of trust. You are left holding the paper, looking at the words, and feeling a sudden, cold sense that you have been played. That is what happened in Roswell. The flying disc didn't just disappear. It was forcibly removed from the public imagination and replaced with a weather balloon. It is brilliant in a terrifying sort of way. If they had told people it was a secret weapon or a Soviet drone or something dangerous, people would have been afraid. They would have demanded answers. They would have looked at the sky with paranoia. But by telling them it was a weather balloon, a mundane, forgotten piece of equipment that serves no purpose other than to float up and pop, they drained the mystery of all its oxygen. They didn't just hide the truth, they made the truth uninteresting. And that is the most effective form of censorship there is. I wonder what the journalists felt like. You have a scoop, you have the story of the century, you have confirmed it with the base commander, and then, the next day, you are told it was a mistake. You are told you were wrong. You have to walk back your own reporting. You have to admit in front of your readers that you were fooled by a bit of tinfoil and some balsa wood. It's a humiliation, but more than that, it's a fatigue. It's the kind of thing that makes you stop asking questions altogether. You realize that the people in power have a narrative they want to maintain, and if you get in the way of it, you just end up looking foolish. So the town of Roswell did what any small town would do. They went back to their lives. They went back to the heat, the wind, and the slow, steady grind of daily existence. The flying disc became a local joke, the kind of thing you mention at the bar to get a laugh, the kind of thing you stop bringing up because people look at you like you're trying too hard. The official story was that simple, and the official story was safe. But underneath that, the doubt remained. It didn't go away. It just went underground. It became part of the local lore, a whisper in the dark, a story you told your kids when the house was quiet and the wind was howling outside. It wasn't the kind of thing you wrote in the history books, but it was the kind of thing you felt in your bones. You knew the official story didn't add up. You knew that a weather balloon doesn't cause a military base to lock down, and it doesn't cause soldiers to spend days scouring the desert like they're looking for a lost treasure. The psychology of that retraction is what interests me the most. We are social animals. We rely on our leaders to tell us what is real. When the military, the institution that is supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of reality, tells us that we saw a balloon, we want to believe them. We want to believe that the world is a place where things make sense. We want to believe that there isn't anything out there that is fundamentally beyond our comprehension. To accept the balloon is to accept a world that is manageable. To accept the disc is to accept a world that is wild, unpredictable, and perhaps even dangerous. Most people chose the manageable world. They chose the balloon. They chose the comfort of the status quo. And for a long time, that worked. The Roswell incident faded into the background radiation of the 1950s, overshadowed by the very real, very terrifying threat of the Cold War. We had bigger things to worry about. We had the bomb. We had the space race. We had the fear of the Red Scare. The wreckage at the Foster Ranch was just a footnote in a decade defined by much more immediate anxieties, but the seed had been planted. The idea that they are hiding something, the idea that the truth is being managed, became a permanent part of the American psyche. Roswell wasn't the first time the government kept a secret, and it certainly wasn't the last, but it was the first time we knew they were keeping one. It was the moment the public and the institution locked eyes, and the public realized that the institution was lying. That realization changes your relationship with your world. It makes you a skeptic. It makes you look at the news and the official reports and the confident assertions of the authorities, and you start to wonder what is missing. You start to look for the gaps. You start to look for the things that don't fit, and once you start doing that, you can never stop. You become a person who is constantly looking behind the curtain, always suspicious, always wondering if the story you are being told is the one you are actually living. I think about the people in Roswell who didn't let it go, the ones who kept the stories, the ones who looked at the night sky and felt a sense of anticipation rather than security. They were the ones who carried the flame, keeping the memory alive through the years of silence. They were the ones who refused to be comforted by the weather balloon narrative, and because of them, the incident didn't die. It went into a kind of hibernation, waiting for the right time to wake up, waiting for a generation that wouldn't be satisfied with the simple, boring answers of the past. It's strange how a story can stay alive. It's like a piece of the wreckage itself, tough, resilient, and impossible to destroy. It just sits there, in the collective memory, waiting for someone to pick it up, hold it, and realize that the story we were told just doesn't feel right. And as the decades passed, that is exactly what happened. The story began to grow, to change, to take on new layers of meaning. The weather balloon wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was the starting gun for a new kind of modern myth. I often wonder what it was like to walk down the main street of Roswell in the early 50s. You have this massive event, this crack in the reality of your town, and then suddenly it is forbidden to talk about it. It's not that you are thrown in jail for mentioning it, but there is a social pressure, a quiet, unspoken understanding that some subjects are simply closed. It's a very human reaction to take a trauma or a mystery and bury it under the surface of the mundane. You focus on the harvest, you focus on the weather, you focus on the local gossip, and you act as if the sky above you is just an empty expanse of blue. But that kind of denial takes a toll. It creates a psychological split. On one hand, you have the life you are living, the life that is being reported in the papers and described by the officials. On the other hand, you have the memory of the wreckage, the memory of the soldiers, the memory of the strange, electric tension that hung over the town for those few days. You learn to hold two conflicting realities in your mind at the same time. You become a person who knows two stories, and you have to be very careful about which one you tell. I think about the people who left the base during those years. They went home to their families, they went to work in factories, they bought houses in the suburbs, and they carried that secret with them. They were part of a silent fraternity, bound together by the knowledge of what they had seen and by the pressure to never say a word. It must have been exhausting in a quiet, subtle way. To be part of the most important event in history and to have to pretend it was just a weather balloon. It's a peculiar kind of burden to be a custodian of a secret that has been officially declared non-existent. And what about the desert itself? Did the people who worked the land nearby feel a sense of unease when they looked out toward the Foster Ranch? Did they give it a wide berth, not because they were scared of anything coming out of it, but because they didn't want to be reminded of what had gone into it? There is a natural tendency to avoid places where things have gone wrong. You don't want to step on the site of a tragedy or a mystery. You want to let the earth heal, let the grass grow back, let the memory fade. It's a way of protecting yourself. But memories, especially the ones that are forced into the shadows, have a way of surviving. They don't die, they change, they become folklore, they become ghost stories. They become the kind of thing you talk about in hushed tones after the kids have gone to bed. And I think that is exactly what happened in Roswell. The incident turned into a myth, a localized, internal piece of culture that kept the town connected to the sky, even as the official narrative tried to tie it down to the ground. It also changed the way we looked at our own technology. During those years, we were entering the space age. We were building rockets, we were looking at the moon as a destination, and we were projecting our own anxieties about the Cold War onto the stars. We looked up and we wondered if the lights we saw were our own, or if they belonged to someone else. And because we had been told the Roswell story was a lie, we weren't ready to believe the official version of anything we saw in the sky. We had been trained to look for the cover-up. We had been trained to assume that there was always a secret mission, a hidden agenda, a truth that was being kept from us. It's a strange foundation for a culture, isn't it? To be built on the assumption that you are being lied to. It creates a baseline of suspicion that never really goes away. It turns the sky from a source of wonder into a source of uncertainty. You look up and instead of seeing the infinite, you see a potential threat, or a hidden operation, or a piece of evidence that the government is trying to hide. We lost a bit of our innocence in that desert, a bit of our ability to just look up and dream without wondering what the catch was. I think that is the saddest part of the whole Roswell story. It isn't just about aliens or spaceships. It's about the loss of a shared, transparent reality. We stopped living in a world where we could agree on what we saw, and we started living in a world where every observation is a battlefield. Every strange light is an argument. Every unexplained event is a conspiracy. And that divide started in a pasture, in a storm, on a night when a rancher found something he couldn't name. And so the town waited. They lived through the 50s, they lived through the 60s, and all the while the secret sat there, dormant like a seed in the soil. It wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. It was waiting for a generation that had the tools to investigate, the curiosity to ask questions, and the lack of fear to challenge the official record. It was waiting for the time when the silence would finally be broken. The desert remained the same. The wind blew, the sand shifted, and the sun rose and set over the same empty fields. But the story was growing. It was gathering strength, like a pressure system building in the atmosphere. It was a secret that was ready to be told, and all it needed was a spark. And as we move forward in this story, I find myself thinking about how much of our lives are governed by things we don't say. How many of our personal histories are built on the things we chose to hide, the things we chose to bury, and the things we hope will never, ever be uncovered. We are all living on our own ranches, in a way. We all have our own debris fields. And we all spend our lives wondering if the truth will eventually come to light, or if it will stay buried, safe and quiet, under the shifting sands of our own memory. We talk about the desert and we talk about the wreckage, but we often forget to talk about the air, the atmosphere. In the late 40s, the air in this country was different. It wasn't just the heat of the summer or the dust of the plains. It was a heavy, stifling weight that had settled over the entire world. We had just finished the most destructive war in human history, and instead of finding the peace we were promised, we found ourselves staring into the mouth of something even darker, the Cold War, the atomic age. It was a time when the word secret became a foundational element of American life. You had the Manhattan Project, you had the development of the bomb, you had the creeping fear of the Soviet Union. Everything from the design of a circuit board to the location of a storage facility was stamped with a classification. And when you live in a world where everything is a secret, the truth stops being a priority. It becomes a liability. Think about the people at the Roswell Army Airfield. They weren't just soldiers. They were the 509th Composite Group. They were the men who held the power to end the world in their hands. That kind of responsibility does things to a person. It creates a firewall around the mind. You stop seeing the world as a place of open inquiry and start seeing it as a series of vulnerabilities. You start to view every anomaly, every mystery, every strange piece of debris as a potential breach in your perimeter. When you look at the Roswell incident through that lens, the cover-up doesn't look like a diabolical plot to hide aliens. It looks like a reflex. It looks like the standard operating procedure for a military that had been trained to view every unknown as a threat. If something crashes, you don't call the scientists, you call the security teams. You don't ask what it is, you ask who saw it. And you certainly don't let the public walk around with bits of the unknown in their pockets. You contain it, you sweep it up. You sanitize it. It wasn't just about Roswell. Roswell was just one of 1,000 potential lakes in a system that was built on the premise that the public couldn't handle the truth. We were living in a culture where the government believed that knowledge was something to be rationed, something to be distributed only to those with the right clearance. And because they were so busy guarding their own secrets, they became incapable of telling the truth about anything else. I find that idea deeply sad. We think of the government as this monolith, this all-knowing entity that moves with cold efficiency. But the reality is that the institutions we build are just reflections of our own fear. The Cold War was driven by fear. Fear of the bomb, fear of the Soviets, fear of the unknown. And that fear manifested as an impenetrable wall of silence. Roswell was just the first brick in that wall. Imagine being one of the lower-level officers at the base. You are living in a town where everyone knows everyone. Your kids go to school with the ranchers' kids. You drink at the same bars. You want to be a good neighbor, but you also have your orders. You have the oath you swore. You have the crushing weight of the National Security Act, which was being written around that very same time. You are trapped between your humanity and your duty. You see the debris, you know it's weird, but you also know that your career, and perhaps your life, depends on your silence. Is it any wonder that the truth got lost? Is it any wonder that the story became a tangled mess of half-truths and official denials? The environment was poisoned. There was no way to tell the truth without crossing a line that you weren't allowed to cross. So you lied. You lied to the press, you lied to the neighbors, and eventually you started to lie to yourself. You convinced yourself that it was a weather balloon, not because you believed it, but because it was the only way to sleep at night. We look back at that era with a sense of nostalgia, the cars, the music, the feeling of optimism, but we forget the paranoia. We forget that underneath the surface, there was a frantic, desperate effort to keep the walls from collapsing. Every secret was a brick, and we were building a fortress. And the more we built, the more isolated we became. We weren't just protecting ourselves from the Soviets, we were protecting ourselves from reality. I think about the rancher, Mac Brazel, and the military men who arrived at his property. They were two different worlds trying to occupy the same space. One world lived by the seasons and the land, the other lived by the clock and the command. and the collision between them was inevitable. The military couldn't leave the debris alone, and the rancher couldn't keep his discovery to himself. It was a mismatch of cultures, a mismatch of values, and a mismatch of realities. In the end, the culture of secrecy won. It always does because it has all the power. It has the archives, the classification stamps, and the authority to say what happened and what didn't. But the cost of that victory was the loss of our ability to trust. We lost the connection to the story that actually happened in the pasture, and we replaced it with a story that was designed to protect the fortress. And we have been living in the ruins of that fortress ever since. We are still living in the shadow of the Cold War. Even now, decades later, we still feel that suspicion. We still look at the government and wonder what else is in the hangars. We still look at the sky and wonder what else they are hiding. We never really moved past that moment in 1947. We just got better at holding the secret. We just got better at living with the lie. The desert hasn't changed. It is still out there, the same vast, indifferent space, waiting for the wind to uncover something else. But we have changed. We have become a culture of secrets, a culture of suspicion, a culture that is always looking for the thread that will unravel the whole garment. And I wonder if we could go back to that night in July, if we could tell them that the secret wouldn't stay buried, would they have done it differently? Or were they always destined to lock the door and throw away the key? The 60s felt like they were in a rush. The world was changing, everything was turning over, and the past felt like something we were all trying to outrun. During those years, Roswell was barely a whisper. It wasn't on the news, it wasn't in the papers, and it certainly wasn't the center of a global conversation. It was just a local story, a piece of small-town trivia that you might mention if you were having a drink and the conversation hit a lull. The military had done its job. They had successfully turned the event into a nothing, a bit of bureaucratic noise that had been archived and forgotten. And that is a strange thing to think about, how history can just drift away. We assume that the important things are written down, that they are preserved, that they form the bedrock of our understanding. But history is made of memory, and memory is a fragile, rotting thing. If you don't keep it alive, if you don't repeat the story, it simply fades. It becomes less true and more vague, until it's just a feeling you have about something that might have happened a long time ago. For those decades, Roswell lived in that gray area. It wasn't dead, but it wasn't alive. It was just a dormant rumor. The people who knew, the ones who had seen the debris or heard the stories at the base, were getting older. They were settling into their lives, raising their families, and looking at the horizon, maybe wondering if the story would ever be told. But the culture wasn't ready to listen. The culture was looking for other things, for a landing on the moon, for the end of a war, for a revolution in how we lived. We were looking forward, and looking back at a pasture in New Mexico felt like a waste of time. I think about the researchers who finally started to dig it up in the 70s. They were a different breed. They weren't looking for national security, they were looking for the truth. They were people who had that same stubborn, nagging doubt that had been sitting in the back of our collective minds for years. They started showing up in Roswell with tape recorders and notebooks, asking questions. And it must have been a shock to the town, to have people come from the outside, people who didn't care about the official story, and who were suddenly taking your local joke seriously. that had to change the way the people of Roswell saw their own history. It's an interesting thing, the act of re-interviewing. When you ask someone about a memory that is 20 or 30 years old, you aren't just getting the facts. You are getting the story they have told themselves over and over again. You are getting the memory, filtered through the decades of silence, the decades of denial, and the decades of wondering if they were right. It's like archaeology. You are digging through layers of sediment, trying to find the bedrock, but the bedrock itself has been worn smooth by time. But what they found as they started to piece it together was a consensus. It wasn't just one person with a wild story. It was a pattern. It was the same details, surfacing in interviews with people who hadn't spoken to each other in years. The same descriptions of the material, the same descriptions of the secrecy, the same descriptions of the fear. And when you start to see that pattern emerge, you stop calling it a weather balloon. You start calling it a narrative. There is a shift that happens when a secret becomes a shared history. You stop being alone in your doubt. You realize that there were others who were sitting in their houses, looking at the same dark sky and thinking the same thoughts. The loneliness of the secret begins to dissolve, and I think that was the true birth of the Roswell phenomenon as we know it today. It wasn't the crash, it was the conversation. It was the moment we started talking to each other again, comparing notes and refusing to accept the official silence. I wonder if the military knew what was happening. Did they see these researchers moving through the desert, collecting the stories, and feel a sense of unease? Or did they just dismiss it? They were experts at dismissal. They had perfected the art of the bureaucratic shrug. They had made a career out of saying, "Move along, nothing to see here." But this time it was different. This time the people were talking back. It's hard to stay silent when you realize that your silence has been used against you. When the people of Roswell started to talk, they weren't just telling a story about a flying disc. They were reclaiming their own experience. They were saying, "I know what I saw, and no one has the right to tell me I didn't." And that is a powerful thing. It is an act of defiance against a reality that has been imposed from the outside. I think about those researchers traveling from house to house, sitting at kitchen tables, drinking coffee and listening. They were the ones who finally gave the secret a home. They were the ones who took the fractured, isolated memories and wove them into a story that the rest of us could understand. They weren't soldiers, they weren't politicians, and they weren't trying to hide anything. They were just people who wanted to know. And in that search, they turned a footnote into a legend. The desert was still there, of course. The wind was still blowing. The sky was still the same, but the way we looked at it had changed. We weren't just looking at the sky anymore. We were looking at our own history. We were looking at the gaps in our records, the contradictions in our official stories, and the stubborn, unbreakable reality of what people remember. And in that search, I think we found something much more important than a crashed object. We found the courage to ask questions again. When you start pulling at a thread, you never know what the whole garment is going to look like when it unravels. That's what those early investigators found out. They didn't go into the desert with a master plan. They went in with curiosity. They went in with the desire to do what the authorities hadn't. They listened. And what they heard wasn't just a single, polished story. They heard a chorus. They heard the jagged, fragmented, deeply personal testimonies of people who had been holding their breath for 30 years. There is something deeply moving about that, the idea of people waiting for their entire adult lives to be asked the right question. You have these older men and women, the people who were there, who had lived their lives in the shadow of the secret, and suddenly someone is sitting across the table with a tape recorder, looking them in the eye and saying, "Tell me." You can feel the relief in those accounts. It wasn't just about the flying disc. It was about validation. It was about being told that their memory mattered, that they weren't crazy, and that the thing they had seen in that pasture really did happen. But there is a danger in that, too. When you ask someone to recall a memory that has been sitting in the dark for decades, it shifts, it grows. It takes on the shape of all the other stories they've heard, all the books they've read, all the movies they've seen. The line between what happened and what we think happened starts to blur. I don't think they were lying. I don't think they were making it up. I think they were doing what we all do. They were trying to make sense of a fragment of the impossible by using the only tools they had. And the story grew. It morphed from a local mystery into a national obsession. It became the template for every alien encounter, every cover-up, every secret government project that followed. Roswell stopped being a town in New Mexico and became a state of mind. It became the place we go when we suspect that the world isn't as transparent as we want it to be. And that is a powerful, dangerous, and intoxicating thing. I imagine the reaction of the establishment during this time. Did they even notice? I think at first they probably didn't. They had dismissed the story so thoroughly, so completely, that they didn't believe it could ever resurface. They thought they had scrubbed the board clean, but you can't scrub the collective memory. You can suppress a story, but you can't kill it. If anything, the suppression makes it stronger. It gives it a charge, a vitality, a sense of forbidden knowledge that draws people in. It must have been infuriating for the military to see this thing coming back from the dead. After all the effort, after the press releases and the cleanups and the decades of silence, to see it all come flooding back because of a few books and a few intrepid researchers, that has to feel like a failure of control. But it wasn't a failure of control. It was the inevitability of the truth. You can manage information, you can manage the media, but you cannot manage human curiosity. It is the one variable you can never account for. There is a sense of inevitability in the way the Roswell story took over the world. It filled a void. We were a generation that had lost its faith in the institutions that claimed to protect us. We had seen the scandals. We had seen the wars. We had seen the way the truth was manipulated for political ends. Roswell became the touchstone for that distrust. It became the proof that we were right to be suspicious, but I wonder if we lost something in the process. I wonder if, by turning Roswell into a global phenomenon, we stopped looking at the reality of it. We stopped looking at the dry grass and the wet dirt and the tired man on a ranch, and we started looking at a logo. We started looking at a brand. We started looking at the idea of the cover-up rather than the experience of the event. We made it a spectacle, and spectacle is the enemy of the quiet, contemplative human truth. I think about the people who were actually there, the ones who didn't want the spectacle. Did they feel like their experience was being hijacked? Did they look at the magazines and the television specials and feel like the truth of what they had seen was being drowned out by the noise? I imagine so. There is a deep loneliness in having your reality turned into a commodity. Your secret, your burden, your impossible memory. Suddenly, it belongs to everyone and no one. We are still living with the fallout of that. We are still living in a world where we don't know what to believe. We look at the reports, we look at the documents, we look at the testimony, and we are left with the same question that Mac Brazel had when he walked through that pasture. What is this? We are still trying to figure out if it was a visitor from the stars, a secret project from the earth, or just a trick of the light that we have turned into a monster because we were too afraid to look it in the eye. The story isn't over. It's still growing, it's still shifting, it's still waiting for the next generation of truth seekers to come along and dig a little deeper. And maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Maybe the mystery isn't meant to be solved. Maybe the mystery is the point. Maybe the mystery is the only thing that keeps us looking, keeps us questioning, and keeps us from accepting the simple, boring, sanitized reality that we are fed every single day. The desert hasn't changed. It is still out there, under the same wide, uncaring sky, holding its secrets in the sand. And as we continue to talk about Roswell, as we continue to turn it over in our minds, I find myself thinking not about the crash, but about the rancher. I think about him and the way he felt when he touched the metal that wouldn't crush. That was a real moment. That was a human moment. And no matter how much the story grows, no matter how much the myth takes over, that moment, that quiet, strange, lonely moment in the pasture, remains the heart of it all. It remains the truth, tucked away in the shadows, waiting for us to stop shouting and start listening again. There is a kind of trap in the truth. We spend so much time looking for the big answer, the grand revelation, that when the reality finally surfaces, we don't know what to do with it. We want the world to be a stage for something monumental, but history has a way of being messy, disappointing, and aggressively mundane. When the government finally released the files on Project Mogul, the reaction wasn't relief. It was a kind of collective, bewildered silence. For those who don't know, Project Mogul was real. It wasn't a cover story, and it wasn't a joke. It was a high-altitude balloon project designed to listen for Soviet nuclear tests. It used acoustic sensors and microphones, suspended from long chains of balloons, drifting high above the desert floor. It was a secret, a genuine, high-stakes military secret that carried the weight of the Cold War. And when one of these balloon trains went down, when the equipment scattered across a rancher's pasture, the military panicked, not because they had found an alien, but because they had lost a piece of their most sensitive espionage technology. I think about the logic of it. It's almost too clean, isn't it? The foil, the balsa wood, the strange, flowered tape, that was all part of the balloon train. The descriptions of the debris that the witnesses gave matched the materials used in the project with a terrifying, clinical precision. When you look at the evidence through the lens of Mogul, everything falls into place. The secrecy makes sense. The panicked retraction makes sense. The way they scrambled to clean up the site makes sense. It wasn't about guarding a spacecraft. It was about protecting a spy program. And yet, why does it feel like such an empty answer? I think it's because the truth of Project Mogul is, in its own way, just as cynical as the conspiracy. It reveals that the military wasn't hiding something magical. They were hiding something petty. They were hiding their own failures, their own secrets, their own obsession with surveillance. It strips the romance out of the mystery. It turns the crash from a moment of cosmic wonder into a mundane, bureaucratic embarrassment. And for many people, that is harder to accept than the alien theory. We can live with aliens. Aliens are grand, they are terrifying, they are worthy of our attention. But a failed spy experiment, a pile of trash from a balloon project that couldn't even stay in the sky, that feels like an insult. There is a psychological resistance to the official truth. We want our secrets to be beautiful. We want them to be meaningful. When we find out that the secret was just more of the same, more Cold War paranoia, more clumsy engineering, more government deception, it makes us feel like we've been fooled twice. We were fooled by the mystery, and then we were fooled by the reality. I wonder if that is why the debunkers struggle so much to win the argument. They come with the files, they come with the photos, they come with the declassified reports, and they think that facts are enough to kill a legend. But facts don't kill legends. Legends aren't built on facts, they're built on feelings. They're built on the human need to believe that there is something more going on than just the grinding gears of our own institutions. Mogul explains the what, but it doesn't explain the why. It doesn't explain why the desert felt so heavy. It doesn't explain why the air felt so charged. It makes me realize how little the truth actually matters in the face of a story that has already captured the heart. If you tell someone that the light they saw in the sky was a balloon, they'll nod and walk away, but they won't feel convinced, because the balloon doesn't explain the way their heart raced. It doesn't explain the awe. It doesn't explain the silence of the desert night. The truth feels insufficient. It feels like a small, narrow answer to a vast, sprawling question. But maybe there is something to be said for the mundane. Maybe there is a lesson in the fact that our greatest mysteries are often just the result of our own shadows. We look into the dark and we see monsters, but usually we are just seeing our own reflection, magnified by our fear and our desire for something more. The military was looking for the Soviets, the public was looking for the truth, and the rancher was just looking for his sheep. And in the middle of it all, a balloon train came down, and we all spent 70 years trying to turn it into something else. It's a beautiful, tragic comedy, really. We are so desperate to be special that we will invent a cosmic drama just to avoid the fact that we are just humans, stumbling around in the dark, dropping our toys, and then spending decades lying to each other about why it happened. We are the architects of our own confusion. We are the ones who write the scripts, and as long as we keep writing them, the truth will always feel like a disappointment. But I think about the soldiers again, the ones who had to sweep the field. They weren't looking for aliens. They were looking for microphones. They were looking for the secret sensors that were supposed to track the nuclear pulse of the world. They knew the truth, or at least they knew enough of it. And for them, the secret wasn't a myth. It was a job. It was a burden. It was the crushing reality of a world that was trying to listen to the heartbeat of a war that was always about to start. When you look at the declassified documents for Project Mogul, you don't see a grand cover-up of alien life. You see a grand cover-up of a failure. You see the paperwork of people who were terrified of losing their funding, terrified of the Soviets, and terrified of their own superiors. And there is something strangely human about that. It isn't a story of godlike beings or interdimensional travelers. It's a story of people in offices trying to manage a messy, unpredictable world with the limited tools they had. but does that make it better? I'm not sure. There is a sense of betrayal in the truth, too. We were told for years that the military couldn't explain what happened. We were told that it was a mystery, an anomaly, a breach in the expected order of things. To find out that it was just a secret project, a project that was, quite frankly, a bit of a disaster, feels like the final punchline. It turns the entire Roswell legend into a story about a misunderstanding. I often wonder if the people who lived through it, the ones who stood in that field and felt the alien texture of the debris, ever read those reports. If they did, I imagine they felt a deep, quiet resentment, because the report doesn't account for the feeling. It doesn't account for the way the air shifted, or the way the heart raced, or the sense that something truly impossible had touched the ground. You can't put that into a report about acoustic sensors and balloon trains. You can't quantify the awe. That's why the conspiracy persists. It's not because the truth is hidden. It's because the truth is insufficient. We need the Roswell story to be something more than a balloon. We need it to be a bridge to something else, something that gives us a sense of purpose, or at least a sense of curiosity. If we accept the Mogul explanation, we accept a world that is a little bit smaller, a little bit colder, and a little bit more governed by bureaucratic accidents than by cosmic destiny. And that is a hard pill to swallow for a species that is so desperate to be part of a bigger story. Yet, there is a certain kind of beauty in the Mogul truth, if you look at it the right way. It paints a picture of a world that is always straining against the dark. It shows us a military that was so obsessed with the invisible, the sound waves, the pulses, the hidden signals of the enemy, that they were willing to fill the sky with their own strange, silver shapes. There is something haunting about the image of those balloon trains, drifting in the night, carrying their microphones and their sensors, listening to the heartbeat of a war that wasn't happening yet. In a way, they were just as alien as anything we could have invented. They were our own technological phantoms, floating in the dark, watching us back. Maybe the reason we have such a hard time letting go of the alien narrative is because we are so lonely. We are sitting here on this little planet, spinning through the void, trying to listen for a signal that never comes. We want to believe that there is someone out there, someone who is paying attention, someone who might leave a piece of themselves behind in a pasture. Project Mogul is the reality of our loneliness, the reality that all we have is ourselves, and all we can do is try to listen to each other's secrets across the vast, dark distances. But that's a heavy thought to carry. It's much easier to imagine that we aren't alone. It's much easier to imagine that the strange, tough foil we found was a gift, or a message, or a warning. It's easier to be afraid of the unknown than it is to be disappointed by the known. And so, we keep the myth alive. We keep the story of Roswell as a place where the barrier between us and the infinite was thinned, even if, in the end, it was just a tethered string of balloons. I try to let go of the need for an answer. I try to let go of the anger I feel when I think about the cover-up, or the deception, or the way we've been played by our own history. It's all just human noise. It's all just part of the same messy, evolving story. We are a species that is still learning how to be honest with ourselves, and that is a process that takes a long, long time. We aren't there yet. We are still in the pasture, looking at the debris, trying to figure out what it means to be here, and what it means to be looking at the sky with such a desperate need to see something that looks back. For tonight, I think we can leave it there. The crash happened or it didn't. It was a saucer or it was a balloon. The secret was kept or it was revealed. None of it changes the fact that you are here, that the night is quiet, and that the stars are still there, shining in their own cold, distant way. We are just observers, watching the history unfold, and even if we don't have all the answers, we have the peace of knowing that we are part of the unfolding. The mystery is safe. The story is ours, and for now, that is enough. There is a fragility to the human memory that we often overlook when we try to reconstruct events from the past. We treat it like a camera, as if we could just rewind the tape and see exactly what happened on that July night in 1947. But memory is not a camera. It is a living, breathing, shifting thing. It is a story we tell ourselves, and every time we tell it, we smooth out a rough edge, we sharpen a detail, or we let a bit of the color fade. When you listen to the testimonies of the people who were at Roswell, you are not hearing a police report. You are hearing a life being summarized in the face of an impossible event. I have spent a long time thinking about the voices that emerge from the archives. The old men and women who, decades after the fact, finally decided to speak. They had been silent for so long, carrying the weight of that summer in their pockets like a heavy stone. When they finally started to talk, you could hear the tremor in their voices. It wasn't just the tremor of age. It was the tremor of having to face a reality that no one else wanted to believe. To be a witness to the impossible is a lonely burden. You walk through your life knowing that you hold a piece of the truth, but everywhere you look, you see people who are perfectly content with the lie. We often weigh the value of a witness based on how much they agree with the official record. If they say balloon, we call them reliable. If they say disc, we call them confused or prone to fantasy. But that is a cold, bureaucratic way to measure the truth. A person's testimony is not just a collection of facts. It is an artifact of their existence. When someone says, "I saw something that didn't belong," they are telling you about a moment where their world fractured. They are telling you about a day where the rules stopped working. I imagine the process of remembering. You sit in a chair, someone puts a microphone in front of you, and you are asked to go back to a place you haven't visited in 40 years. You have to navigate the years of silence, the years of doubt, the years of wondering if you should have said anything at all. You have to find that fragment of time hidden away in the attic of your mind and pull it into the light. And when you do, you don't just see the object. You see the heat. You see the dust. You see the faces of the soldiers who stood by the trucks. You see the look in their eyes, a look that told you, louder than any words, that this was not a balloon. That look is the piece of evidence that the official reports can never declassify. You can't write a memo about the way a soldier's eyes betrayed his fear. You can't file a report on the way the air felt heavy before the convoy arrived. These are the details that exist only in the witness, and they are the reason why the Roswell story will never truly be closed. Because for those who were there, the balloon explanation is not just factually incorrect. It is an insult to their experience. It is a way of telling them that their fear, their wonder, and their moment of contact were all just a misunderstanding. But we have to be careful with that. We have to be careful not to mistake the intensity of the memory for the accuracy of the facts. A person can be completely honest and still be completely wrong. They can be a witness to their own confusion. And that doesn't make their testimony any less important, but it does make it complex. It makes it a reflection of the time, the place, and the person, rather than a transcript of the event. Why do we cling to these stories? Why do we value the account of a single, aging witness over the declassified documents of a government agency? I think it is because we are starving for a human connection to the mystery. Documents are cold. They are written in the dry, sterile language of a committee. They don't have a pulse, but the witness has a pulse. The witness has a life. The witness is someone who walked the same dirt, breathed the same air, and felt the same wonder that we do. We trust them because we see ourselves in them. We trust them because they represent the possibility that the mystery is real, and that it is something we, too, could encounter if we were in the right place at the right time. It is a beautiful thing, in a way. To have a history that is made up of voices, rather than just files, it makes the mystery feel lived in. It makes the truth feel like something we are building together, piece by piece, story by story. It reminds me that we are not just subjects of a government or data points in an archive. We are the ones who saw. We are the ones who wondered. And as long as those voices are still out there, the truth of what happened in New Mexico will never be fully contained. It will always be something that belongs to us. There is a defiance in those old interviews, if you look closely. It isn't just the defiance of someone who is stubbornly holding onto a story. It is the defiance of someone who has realized that their own life experience is worth more than a government memo. When a witness sits in a chair, decades later, and insists that what they saw was not a balloon, they are making a claim on their own reality. They are saying that the world they experienced is more important than the world they were told to accept. And that, I think, is the most powerful kind of testimony there is. We often think of these people as victims of the Roswell event, but perhaps they were its most important guardians. Without them, the story would have been erased. Without them, the weather balloon explanation would have been the only thing left in the history books. They kept the other version of the story alive, not for money, not for fame, but because they couldn't live in a world where they were being lied to. They held onto the wreckage, metaphorically speaking, because it was the only way to hold onto the truth of their own lives. I imagine the difficulty of that. To live in a small town, to go to the grocery store, to raise your children, and all the while to know that you are carrying a piece of information that is radioactive. You learn to read people. You learn who you can trust and who you can't. You learn to speak in hints and half sentences. You build a life around the secret, a life that is shaped by the things you don't say. That kind of self-censorship is a heavy, invisible cage. It keeps you safe, yes, but it also keeps you trapped. And that is why the debunkers never quite succeed. They are fighting a war with facts, but the people they are fighting are living in a war of experience. You can show someone 1,000 documents that say balloon, and they will look at you with a quiet, sad knowing in their eyes because they were there. They felt the heat. They smelled the desert dust. They heard the sounds. You cannot debunk an experience. You can only ignore it, and that is exactly what happened. The establishment ignored the experience of its own people, and in doing so, it alienated them. We have to ask ourselves, what does it say about us that we have built a society where the official record and the personal experience are so fundamentally at odds? It suggests that we are living in a fractured reality. We have the official version, which is neat, clean, and safe, and then we have the lived version, which is messy, strange, and often inexplicable, and we have no way to bring those two together. We are constantly oscillating between them, trying to decide which one to believe, and usually ending up in a state of permanent uncertainty. I think about the scientists who worked on the balloon projects. I don't think they were villains. I think they were just people doing a job. They were looking for the Soviets. They were looking for nuclear tests. They were looking for security. They weren't looking to destroy the Roswell story. They were just looking to make sure the project succeeded. It was a collision of intentions. On one side, you had a military trying to keep the world safe through secrecy. On the other side, you had a witness trying to reconcile their reality with the truth. Both sides were, in their own way, trying to find order in a world that was threatening to fall apart. But the price of that order was the truth. The price of that security was the integrity of our shared history. And that is a price that we are still paying today. We are paying it every time we see a headline we don't trust. We are paying it every time we look at the government and wonder what they are hiding. We are paying it every time we have to choose between the comfortable lie and the impossible truth. The witnesses are disappearing now. The generation that saw the crash, the generation that felt the desert wind and held the strange foil in their hands, they are leaving us. And when they go, they take the story with them. They take the tremor in their voices, the look in their eyes, and the final, absolute certainty that they saw something that wasn't a balloon. And we are left with the archives. We are left with the transcripts, the videos, and the files. We are left with the artifacts of their experience, but we are losing the witnesses themselves. Does that matter? Maybe not. Maybe the story is now bigger than the people who started it. Maybe Roswell has become a part of our modern mythology, a foundational story that we need to tell, regardless of whether it's true in the way we want it to be. Maybe it doesn't matter if it was a saucer or a balloon. Maybe what matters is that it was a moment where we reached out and we looked and we wondered. And that curiosity, that refusal to just accept the official silence, is what makes us human. It is a quiet thought to leave you with as the night moves on. We are all just witnesses to our own lives, trying to figure out what is real, trying to make sense of the debris that falls into our own paths. We are all trying to decide what to hold onto and what to let go of. And the next time you find yourself wondering about the truth, or wondering if you're being told the whole story, just remember the people in the desert. Remember that they were just people, trying to understand what they had found, and that in the end, their story is the one that lasted. The silence might be loud, the secrets might be deep, but the human voice, the voice that says, "I was there, I saw it," that is the only thing that can cut through the dark. The desert is quiet now. The shadows are long and the stars are out, bright and indifferent. There is no crash tonight. There is only the stillness, the slow, rhythmic rotation of the earth, and the sound of your own breathing in the quiet of your room. Everything is okay. The mystery is safe. And you, for tonight, are done with the wondering. You can let the story rest. You can let the desert be, just breathe and sleep. It is a strange thing what happened to that town. If you go to Roswell today, you can see how the entire identity of the place is built around an event that happened 70 years ago in a field just outside of it. It is a shrine. And you have to wonder in the quiet of the night why we need a shrine for this. Why do we need a place to go, a physical point on the map where we can stand and say, this is where it started? I think it's because we are looking for a genesis. We are looking for the moment when our modern world collided with the infinite, and we want to believe that there is a place where the connection actually happened. We have a deep, gnawing loneliness as a species. We look at the stars, we look at the vast, cold emptiness of the space between the galaxies, and we feel an ache that is hard to name. We don't want to be the only ones. We don't want to be the only consciousness in the universe, the only ones building, the only ones thinking, the only ones wondering. That kind of solitude is terrifying. It makes our existence feel accidental, small, and ultimately meaningless. And so we cling to Roswell. We cling to the idea that something or someone came to see us. It's a narrative of validation. If they came, even if it was just a crash, even if it was just a mistake, it means we are on the map. It means we are worth visiting. It means that there is something out there, something capable of crossing the dark, and that we are the destination. That is a comforting thought, in a way. It changes the universe from an empty, indifferent void into a neighborhood, even if it is a neighborhood where we are the ones who don't quite know what is going on. We see this pattern everywhere in our myths. We always want to be visited. We want a higher intelligence to step in, to offer us a piece of technology, to give us a warning, or to just acknowledge that we exist. We are like children waiting for a parent to come home, or waiting for a teacher to notice our work. We want to be recognized, and the Roswell incident has become the ultimate container for that hope. It is the story that says, we are not alone, and they came here. But I wonder if this obsession also keeps us from looking at the reality of our own situation. We are so focused on the idea of an external intelligence, an external power, an external savior or threat, that we forget to look at ourselves. We are so busy scanning the skies for a sign that we forget to look at the ground beneath our feet. We are waiting for an answer to come from the outside, when the only answers we have are the ones we can find for ourselves. Perhaps the reason Roswell became the global archetype for this feeling is because the desert is so empty. It is the perfect blank slate. You can project whatever you want onto that landscape. You can put the saucer, you can put the bodies, you can put the secret government labs, you can put the grand, sweeping drama of first contact. The desert doesn't argue, it just waits. And because we are so desperate to fill that emptiness with meaning, we have made Roswell the capital of our own existential anxiety. It's not just about aliens. It's about the realization that we are a young, confused species trying to find its way in a dark, complicated room. We are stumbling around, bumping into things, breaking the furniture, and telling ourselves stories to keep from crying. And Roswell is the story we tell ourselves when we need to believe that there is someone else in the room with us. I think about the people who go there now, the pilgrims of the mystery. They aren't looking for a weather balloon. They are looking for a sense of belonging. They are looking for the confirmation that the universe is not just a cold, mechanical process, but a place where something can happen, something that defies the rules, something that breaks the cycle, something that tells us that we are part of a larger, more interesting whole. And in that desire, there is something profoundly human. There is a sweetness to it, a vulnerability that I find hard to dismiss, even if I know the truth is likely much, much quieter. We are lonely and we are curious, and we have built a mythology out of a storm and a rancher and a piece of foil. And maybe that's not a failure. Maybe that's just what we do. We take the debris of our lives, the things that fall out of the sky and land in our fields, and we try to turn them into something that makes sense. We try to turn the wreckage into a map. I often wonder if the people who actually lived in Roswell at the time felt a different kind of loneliness than we do today. For us, the mystery is a pastime. We read about it, we watch documentaries, we listen to stories like this one, and it helps us pass the time. It is a way to occupy our minds, but for them, it was the reality they had to inhabit. They were the ones who had to walk down the street, knowing that a part of their world had been altered, and yet nobody else seemed to notice. That has to be a specific kind of isolation, to be surrounded by people who are living in a completely different version of your own town. It makes me think about our own lives. How many of us are carrying a secret, or a memory, or a truth that doesn't fit into the story that everyone else is telling? How many of us look at the world and feel like we are seeing something that everyone else has decided to ignore? It is a very human experience to feel out of step with the collective narrative. We are all, in our own way, living in our own version of a secret town, waiting for someone to ask us the right question, waiting for someone to validate the reality we are holding in our hands. The obsession with the Roswell incident is a reflection of that. It is a reflection of our desire to have our experience validated. We want the world to acknowledge that there are things we don't understand, that there are gaps in the official record, and that our feelings of strangeness are not just a trick of the light. We want to be told that we aren't crazy for noticing the cracks in the foundation. We want to be told that the debris we've found in our own lives is, in fact, something real, something meaningful, something that points to a larger, more interesting truth. But what if the truth is just that we are all, in our own ways, lost? What if the debris isn't a message from the stars, but just the wreckage of our own attempts to make sense of the world? That is a hard thing to accept, but I think it is also the most liberating thing you can realize. Because if we are all lost, then we are all in the same boat. We are all trying to navigate the same dark. We are all trying to interpret the same signals, and we are all trying to figure out what it means to be here for this brief, flickering moment. We don't need the aliens to give our lives meaning. We don't need the saucers to make us special. The fact that we are here, that we can ask the questions, that we can feel the wonder, that we can sit in the dark and tell stories to each other, that is enough. That is the miracle. We are the universe's way of understanding itself, and we are doing a pretty good job, even with all our confusion, all our secrets, and all our wreckage. As the night deepens, I think about the desert again. It is quiet now, the wind has died down, and the sand is settled. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. The mystery of what fell there, the weather balloon, the spy project, the unnameable debris, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that we cared enough to look. What matters is that we were curious enough to ask. And that curiosity is something you should carry with you, not as a burden, but as a gift. It is the thing that keeps you awake to the beauty of the world, even when the world is dark and the answers are nowhere to be found. You have done enough wondering for tonight. The story of Roswell is just that, a story. It is a piece of history, a bit of folklore, a shadow on the wall of our collective memory. It doesn't have the power to hurt you. It doesn't have the power to define you. You are your own person, living in your own time, and you have the freedom to decide what is real and what is just noise. Let the mystery be. Let the sand cover the tracks. And let your mind drift away from the crash, the bass, and the secrets, and settle into the quiet, simple comfort of the night. You are here, you are safe, and the rest can wait. We have reached the end of the path we started so long ago, or at least, the end of the story we have been telling ourselves. When you strip away the conspiracy theories, the rumors of bodies and ships, and the endless debates over official reports, what are we really left with? We are left with a stretch of desert, a few men who saw something they couldn't name, and a silence that has stretched out over 70 years. It feels almost disappointing, doesn't it? We wanted a mystery that would break the world open, and instead, we got a question that just hangs in the air, refusing to be answered. But I wonder if that disappointment is actually the point. I wonder if our obsession with Roswell, and with these kinds of stories in general, has never really been about the wreckage in the field. It has been about us. It has been about our inability to sit in the dark without asking what is on the other side. We have this deep, restless, unquenchable urge to pull back the curtain, to see the gears, to understand the source code of our reality. It is an instinct that has kept us moving forward as a species, this need to know what lies beyond the horizon, but it also feels like a trap. Think about the sheer amount of energy we have poured into this. We have written books, we have produced shows, we have spent decades arguing with each other about foil and wood and weather balloons. We have turned a summer night in New Mexico into a cornerstone of our modern culture. And we do it because we cannot bear the idea that the story might be finished. We need the mystery. We need the dark places. We need the things we don't understand to keep our minds active, to keep our hearts restless. Because if we ever reached the end, if we ever truly understood what happened, if we ever caught the final piece of the puzzle, what would be left for us to do? I suspect that the fear we project onto Roswell, the fear of a cover-up, the fear of an alien presence, the fear of a government that hides the truth, is really just a fear of our own smallness. We are afraid of what we might find if we look too closely at the universe, and we are afraid of what we might become if we actually succeed. We are terrified that we might finally get the answer to the question of why we are here, and that the answer will be one we cannot live with. We are afraid that the universe is indifferent, that it is vast and cold and doesn't know we are here, and that all our science, all our art, all our love is just a temporary, localized anomaly in a sea of entropy. So we create the conspiracies. We tell ourselves that there is a secret, that there is a hidden agenda, that there is something more profound going on than just the random collision of events. Because if there is a conspiracy, then we matter. If they are hiding something, then it must be something important. If they are keeping us in the dark, then there must be something worth seeing. A universe with a hidden plot is a universe that has meaning. A universe that is just rocks and wind and stars, indifferent to our existence, is a universe that is much harder to inhabit. I think about the people who work at the site or the researchers who still go out there. They are the ones who are actually looking. They are the ones who are staring into the emptiness, and they are the ones who are learning to live with the indifference of it. They have to. They are the frontline. And I wonder if they ever feel that same fear, or if they have transcended it. Do they look at the desert and feel a sense of terror, or do they feel a sense of peace? I like to think it is peace. I like to think that once you get close enough to the silence, you stop looking for meaning in the grand narrative and start finding it in the sheer, staggering complexity of the fact that it is here at all. Maybe curiosity isn't a trap. Maybe it is the only thing that separates us from the silence. We are the universe's way of looking back at itself. We are the eyes, the ears, the consciousness that allows the cosmos to experience its own existence. And when we look into the desert, when we study the reports, when we map the contradictions, we aren't just breaking things. We are observing. We are participating. We are acknowledging that we are part of the process. You've spent enough time in the desert for tonight. We've sifted through the reports, the memories, and the official denials, but at the end of the day, those are just words written over a quiet, sandy field in New Mexico. We want the closure of a perfect answer, a final yes or no that settles everything. But stories like Roswell are like the dunes themselves. They shift, they rearrange, they never stay in the same place twice. Maybe that's the real legacy of 1947. It's not about finding a saucer or a balloon. It's about the fact that humanity once stood in the middle of nowhere, touched something that defied our understanding, and decided that it was worth remembering. Even when we were told to forget, even when the official story tried to flatten the mystery into something boring and small, we remembered. So let the records stay in the dark. Let the military files gather dust. You don't need to carry this mystery into your dreams. The crash, the ranch, the storm, they are all miles and miles away, and they are long ago. The only thing that is real right now is the quiet of your room and the slow, deep rhythm of your own rest. The desert doesn't need to explain itself to you, and you don't need to solve the secrets of the sky before you close your eyes. Everything is anchored. The earth is still beneath you, the night is peaceful, and the story has reached a natural, soft conclusion. Let the debris field go. Let the wind move over the land. You are safe, you are grounded, and the only thing waiting for you now is the deep, dark, comfortable drift of sleep. It's all okay. Rest now.